worse. He seems to be surrendering to the most radical voices in his party in terms of immigration. He's planning to open the southern border even wider than it is open right now. You know, because of coronavirus, the Center for Disease Control used an order that they could for public health called Title 42 to expel certain individuals who are trying to come into the country illegally. We have on good authority that the White House is talking about eliminating this Title 42 and what we've been doing for the last year to keep coronavirus out of the country. And this is a time when there are increased variants of coronavirus, variants of which the most recent one is one that those of us who've been vaccinated may not have the kind of protection that we all believed that we had had. So today we're sending a letter to the President pointing out that every president has a responsibility to protect the safety and the security of the American people. 26 Republicans have signed on to the letter, including Leader McConnell. We're addressing in the letter the concerns we have and the American people have about public health and safety, about the crisis at the border from the standpoint of national security, as well as from the standpoint of the humanitarian crisis. I'm just going to read one paragraph from this letter signed by 26 of us to the President of the United States. Ending this order will have a dire impact on the crisis already engulfing our southwestern border. We urge you in the strongest possible terms not to take this action. Immigration facilities are overwhelmed. Revoking the authority of officials to rapidly expel illegal migrants under Title 42 without a clear plan in place to handle the stress this population will place on the system and on border communities will further exacerbate the crisis at the southwestern border. Senator Capito.
Thank you all. Thank you, Senator Barrasso. And I wanted to join my voice in total agreement with Senator Barrasso on the letter that we sent asking the President not to revoke the Title 42 provisions. I'm the ranking member on the Appropriations Committee for Homeland Security. I see the stresses and strains on the Border Patrol, on ICE, on the facilities, and have visited, as many of us I have, numerous times. I mean, the numbers that we see of apprehensions at the border right now are well over 170,000. We're waiting for the statistics for June. They also, I think, because of Title 42, are able to manage, and I don't think they're managing well, but they can manage in some part some of that population because they are able under Title 42 to turn people back fairly immediately at the border under those provisions. First of all, there's a safety and health provision. We still have provisions in this country where we're still making sure that we're protecting ourselves and being as safe as possible from COVID. Why wouldn't we continue to do that on our southern border and protect our border agents and the ICE and all of the law enforcement that are currently meeting the difficulties of this situation? But a lot of these folks are from border counties or border states that are much more highly impacted than a state like West Virginia. Why does it matter to me? It matters to me because also coming across the border not only are undocumented immigrants coming across the border, but drugs are flooding across our border. If you saw the statistics that were announced today, the amount of deaths from overdoses went up over 29% last year. In my state of West Virginia, it went up over 49%, the deaths. It's fentanyl, it's methamphetamine, and it's coming across the southern border. And if we divert our manpower and womanpower to these over 180,000 or 70,000 undocumented who are flooding across our border, and we are using every single resource we can to meet the human challenge, we're not disrupting the drug traffickers that are killing Americans, killing families, wrecking communities. So this is why I care more than as a non-border state, because it heavily is a very sad and devastating consequence of the deluge of people that are coming. And if Title 42 is taken away, this will be a problem that's only going to get worse. And I'll add in finality, The Biden administration knew, because of the policies that they put into place and that the president promised during his election, that the borders were going to be open, that people were no longer going to be turned away, that policies were going to change. Can you imagine? And they had no plan for it. Can you imagine what would happen and what will happen when Title 42 goes away? I know, because I see where they're spending the money. They have no plan for this flood of humanity. So please, President Biden, please make the right decision. Keep Title 42 in place and plan for what we see as devastating our communities. Thank you.
Senator Capito, of course, is entirely correct. The CDC announced that 93,000 Americans died of drug overdoses last year. 93,000 Americans, many of those drugs coming across the southwestern border. But if you look at the Biden administration's policies, it seems like their prevailing or their dominant theme, the dominant theme is whatever Trump did, we're going to undo. But it gets worse. They don't have an alternative plan in place. For months now, the Border Patrol has told me, as a Texas senator, we're really worried when we lose Title 42 as a tool to control illegal immigration across the border. And in May alone, there were 110,000 migrants returned on an expedited basis using this public health Title 42. If we lose this tool, given what the Biden administration has done, laid out the welcome mat to anybody and everybody who wants to come to the United States illegally without any sort of consequence, they fear that they will simply lose control of the border. The cartels, the transnational criminal organizations, the coyotes, the human smugglers, they're getting rich for every person they can move across the border, and they're literally coming from around the world. You talk to some of the Border Patrol sectors, they've detained people from more than 150 different countries. This is not just a phenomenon for Mexico and Central America. But we are risking, the Biden administration is putting the American people at risk of losing control of our borders entirely. And that means we can't control against the illegal drugs coming across. We can't prevent people from jumping to the head of the line and getting ahead of the people who are trying to do it the right way. America is the most generous country in the world when it comes to legal immigration. We naturalize about 1 million people a year. But this makes a mockery of the rule of law. It's dangerous, and without any plan to transition from Title 42, we risk losing control of the border entirely.
So Title 42 needs to stay in place, no question about it. Should not be rescinded. Also, the migrant protection protocols, or remain in Mexico policy, as well as the third safe country agreements, should remain or be reinstated as well. So in March, myself, along with many others, including a number of folks here, went with Senator Cornyn and Senator Cruz to the Rio Grande Valley. And we were there on the border with the Border Patrol, both at night and during the day. And they told us the incredible difficulty, of course, they're having. You've all seen that. So that was in March. Now, just last week, I went with a bipartisan delegation led by Senator Portman, who will be here shortly, and Senator Kaine. There were 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. We went to Mexico, we were in Ecuador, we were in Colombia, and we were in Guatemala. And clearly, the message there is that if you come up to the border, you're going to be able to stay. I mean, they hire a coyote to bring them. They get 3 chances in case they are returned. But very clearly, the message that they have in Mexico and in Central America and in South America is that if they come up here, they're going to be able to not only get in, but stay. And of course, what does that mean? That means human trafficking. That means drug trafficking. That means more business for the cartels, for the coyotes, more lawlessness. And you're seeing that in the numbers. You saw the numbers. What is May, 180,000, according to Custom and Border Protection, encounters with illegal migrants. That is a 675% increase from May of 2020. And so now the administration is talking about lifting Title 42. Now let me give you one other statistic that I think is pretty important. I think the American people should know. Here are the vaccination rates in a number of Central and South American countries. Venezuela, 3.9%. Ecuador, 9.8%. Colombia, 18%. Mexico, 16%. El Salvador, 20%. Guatemala, 1.1%. Honduras, 0.8%. That's the vaccination rate. Title 42 needs to stay in place.
As a Marine Corps officer who served on the southern border in the Yuma sector of Arizona back in the mid-90s, I saw firsthand the impact of our border crisis. You know, back then I served in an area where there was a serious challenge of human trafficking and drug trafficking. I left, and several years later, a wall was erected in that very area. And we saw the number of illegal crossings plummet. I returned to the same sector in May of this year and discovered that the crisis had returned. Why? A complete vacuum in leadership by the Biden-Harris administration. Look, we have seen an absolute surge in the number of illegal crossings. In fact, we're on track before year's end to see over 1 million illegal crossings. And this is, make no mistake, a 50-state border crisis. This impacts the people of Indiana. In fact, some of these individuals who have illegally crossed have been sent by the Biden administration without consultation with U.S. senators and other elected officials into Fort Wayne, Indiana, and other places across the country, dispersed throughout the country. And the situation's obviously growing worse and worse. Meanwhile, the Biden administration continues to undo much of the good border security work that we've accomplished as Republicans in recent years. Just the latest is this proposal to eliminate Title 42. So it's time that we reestablish leadership. It's time that either President Biden or our southern border czar, Vice President Harris, shows up as it relates to this issue. Lead, follow, or get the heck out of the way.
We were down there in March, and to make it vivid, some of the things I remember most from that trip was when we got down to the Rio Grande that evening, and there, of course, we saw women and children mostly passing us on the way. I thought to myself, there probably wouldn't be much action down at the border on the river, and we get there and there really wasn't, other than the heckling coming from the coyotes and the cartels, taunting the Border Patrol. And to think of these policies that were working so well, and now you've got criminals gaming the system. To put some particulars, it's costing $4,000 to $8,000 per person to come across the border. More if you're from different countries. They said the Del Rio section had 54 different nationalities that had come across illegally in the prior quarter. In this May, 40,000 came over and were in categories from outside of the Northern Triangle. So this is broad, beyond just the ones that are being coaxed to leave where they live and take on that dangerous journey. And to think that it was an unforced error in that, Senator Cornyn mentioned it earlier, we were fixing something that wasn't broken, totally due to being against the policies that were working, told to us by the Border Patrol. Their job had never been easier than when the full effect of the border wall was there, with the anticipation that it was going to be completed, and the stay in Mexico policy. It's a shame that we have all of this just despite a political point of view that was working.
Thank you. I thank my colleagues for being here. I'm the ranking Republican on the Homeland Security Committee with oversight over the Department of Homeland Security. we are facing the worst crisis on our southern border that we've had in at least 2 decades. And it's entirely due to changes in policy from the Biden administration. That's a fact. In particular, because this is about Title 42, they chose to get rid of Title 42 as it related to all children, all unaccompanied children, many families, now most families, and yet they did nothing to prepare for the obvious influx that was going to occur, particularly because they had changed the asylum policy to make it more generous. So it was not only that they revoked Title 42, which at that time particularly, COVID was still raging, not just in America, but even more so south of the border. But they did so without preparing for what they knew was going to happen. That's the height of irresponsibility. Now, sadly, they're talking about doing it again. And this time it'll be with regard to adults. Again, I will just say today, and I'm sure my colleagues have said this, be prepared. They cannot say this time that they don't know there's going to be an influx, because there's obviously going to be an influx. Because many of these adults are now being turned away because of Title 42 and the healthcare emergency. That will be gone. And yet are they doing anything to prepare? Remember, having been down on the border, when the children started coming across, they were stuck into detention facilities run by the Border Patrol that they were only allowed to be in for 72 hours, and many were in there for weeks. And they were living during the COVID period with no COVID testing, inches apart, on the floor, living on mats. Then they went to HHS facilities, which were overcrowded, not prepared for them. There were obviously allegations of abuse that you heard about. Then they were pushed out to families as quickly as they could be, meaning that the sponsors were not properly vetted, which is something I've studied twice now in 2 different reports out of our subcommittee on investigations, with a bipartisan report saying this must stop. There has to be proper vetting of these sponsors. So these are the consequences of a border policy and an immigration policy that is irresponsible. Now look, they have a right to change the asylum policy and to make other changes, but they don't have the right to tell people in Latin America, and I just got back from Ecuador and Guatemala, 2 of the countries that are sending some of the large numbers of kids and families and even adults now across. The presidents of those countries said the same thing. We don't want our people to go. We want our young people to stay and be part of the future of this country. Why are you in America creating a pull factor? Forget the push factor for a minute. We all agree with that. We should do more to help in these countries. But the pull factor is America with an irresponsible policy that tells these coyotes that they can, with credibility, the human smugglers, go to these families and say, give me $10,000 and I'll get your kid into Cincinnati, Ohio, or Charleston, West Virginia, or Fargo, North Dakota. And they can say that with credibility because of the way our asylum policy is working and the lack of Title 42. So before you revoke Title 42, please, I urge the administration, have a policy in place that's responsible to deal with the influx, to be sure that the asylum policy is not exploited as it is now. Only 15% of these people coming, as you know, from Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, in the end, are given asylum because they don't qualify, because they're economic refugees. We all understand why they go. We'd probably do the same thing. It doesn't mean it's right to have a policy that invites people to our border and all of the trauma and the danger of that trip north. So I hope this press conference is helpful, at least in ringing the bell and saying, expect it to happen again unless you put in place responsible policies.
Well, it's been said, changing this policy is a major step. It was enacted in March of 2020. President Biden kept it intact because it was working.
That signal is on SD2.
This will create an even greater surge on the border, has been mentioned countless times. It's a national security issue, and it's a real issue. I was a former chair of Homeland Security. I've spent time on the border, visiting with the guards, the people that work so very hard. It's an issue for them. They truly are overwhelmed. So from a national security standpoint, again, protecting the men and women that are doing such a great job down there, we simply don't need to let this happen. I'll give you an example. In May, 180,000 people crossed the border illegally and were attempted to cross. Of that group, 112,000 were turned back using Title 42. This is a great tool in the toolbox that they desperately need. And that's why, when asked the
former acting head of ICE, they asked him what effect this would have. His answer was, quote, "It would be a catastrophe." So I call on the administration to use some common sense to keep this tool in the toolbox as we face truly an unprecedented surge on our borders.
Biden administration has been in place 175 days. In that 175 days, we've had 4 of the months be the highest number of illegal crossings in 20 years, only to be beaten by the next month, the next month, the next month. The other records are the things that people aren't talking about right now. We have 6,000 ICE agents in the interior of the country. Last month, they did 3,000 deportations. So not only has the administration stopped enforcing what's happening on the southern border, they've stopped enforcing the interior of the country. In the piece that we started talking about 175 days ago, and that was when the Biden administration just stopped construction on the southwest border wall. Today, it's the 14th of July. Today, we spent, as federal taxpayers, $3 million paying contractors not to install the wall. We also paid several $1,000,000 to contractors to watch the steel that's laying on the ground to make sure no one takes it. So far this year, in the 175 days that the Biden administration has put a pause on construction of the wall, we as taxpayers have spent over $1 billion not building the wall. Not building it. That's not $1 billion we get back. That's money that we paid out to literally pay people to watch the steel in the ground and to pay contractors to not actually fulfill their contract. This affects all sorts of businesses along that border as well. I'll give you one example. There's an aggregate and concrete company. It's a small family business. They lost $1.5 million because now over 100 days ago, they were told to pause for 60 days, but to stand by. Stand by. Well, in that standing by, they have to keep their personnel, they have to continue to rent their equipment, they continue to have access to the aggregate, but now 175 days in, they've lost $1.4 million as a company. They're not going to be able to get back and have no idea if they're going to finish this contract or not. This affects employment along the border. This affects the federal taxpayer losing $1 billion. This affects the security of the nation. And for whatever reason, 175 days into the Biden administration, they don't seem to have a plan or care. And that's a challenge for all of us. Because if Title 42 goes away, the #1 issue that the Border Patrol see is we're going to have an astronomical increase of people coming at the border, and this time they won't be turned back. They'll be released into the countries in epic numbers. We should pay attention to this, and we're asking the Biden administration to just enforce the law.
So as John Hoeven and Mike Braun said, 110 days ago, 19 of us, led by Senator Cornyn and Senator Cruz, went down to the border. And what we saw, and what the media who went with us saw clearly, was an open border, humanitarian crisis, national security crisis, healthcare crisis. Clear as day. That is what was going on. We called for the president, vice president, come on down, do what we did, listen, learn, particularly from those on the front line. Took too long, the vice president finally went, but she learned the wrong lesson. And if they're going to learn the lesson of repealing Title 42, that is exactly the opposite thing that needs to happen right now, which is why we're holding this press conference. And dismantling even more of what were clearly successful border security policies by the Trump administration is only going to continue all of these crises: national security, health, and humanitarian. So what's really going on here? I think so many of you know it, but the far left of the Democratic Party is driving all of these policies. Here's another one that we've been talking about a lot. This is the $6 trillion blowout Biden budget. Okay, where are their priorities? Everybody's getting a double-digit increase in terms of federal agencies, except for 2. Homeland Security, 4% cut, and the Department of Defense, 2% cut. Homeland Security and the Department of Defense, what many of us think are the most important agencies in the federal government are being cut, while every other agency is getting massive increases. This is dangerous for our country and something we all oppose. Other areas, American energy being killed right now in terms of production and jobs, driving up gas prices at home, the unprecedented level of spending, inflation going up. All of this is happening right now. We know what's happening. This has become the party of Bernie Sanders, and Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer are just along for the ride. But here's the thing. None of this is supported by the vast majority of the American people, especially not open borders, which is what we're seeing. And I think it's going to be very clear in November in 2022 that the American people are going to reject these far-left policies, especially this one.
The Biden border crisis is getting worse and worse every day. We are on pace for over 2 million people to cross illegally into this country. We have the highest level of illegal immigration in over 20 years. Last year, we had the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. How did we go from incredible success to incredible failure? Joe Biden and Kamala Harris screwed this up. It is their fault. 3 decisions. In the opening week of this administration, Joe Biden halted construction of the border wall. He reinstated the failed policy of catch and release, and most disastrously, he pulled out of the incredibly successful Remain in Mexico international agreement that had resulted in the lowest level of illegal immigration in 45 years. No state in the union is paying a bigger price for the Biden border crisis than our home state of Texas. In Texas, we are seeing the influx of humanity, and what Biden and Harris are counting on is the news media not covering it. They're counting on ABC and CBS and NBC and CNN and MSNBC not showing the Biden cages. A couple of months ago, I brought 19 senators down to the border. We saw the Biden cages, little boys and little girls crammed in at over 1,700% of their capacity. COVID positivity rates of 10%. What Biden and Harris are counting on is the media not covering the little boys and little girls who are being physically assaulted, who are being sexually assaulted by human traffickers in record numbers. You know, the leading paper in Washington has as a slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." Joe and Kamala want darkness on the disaster that they have created. And not only that, they're proposing to make it worse. Joe Biden is now talking about ending Title 42. Title 42 is the tool that has allowed us to prevent people with COVID from being released into this country. We're in a pandemic. Joe Biden likes to talk about what a priority he puts on the pandemic. Understand this. If the Biden administration ends Title 42, they will be releasing illegal immigrants in your community who are COVID positive. We're seeing COVID positivity rates rising in South Texas. We're seeing COVID positivity rising in Laredo. We're seeing COVID positivity rising in San Antonio. Just yesterday, I spoke with the mayor of Uvalde, Texas, who said as a result of the illegal immigrants being released in Uvalde, they're seeing COVID positivity spiking up. And Biden wants to release even more COVID-positive illegal immigrants. This is lunacy. This week I introduced legislation, the SHIELD Act, with a number of senators up here, to codify Title 42 and to stop Joe Biden and Kamala Harris from releasing illegal immigrants in our communities who are positive for COVID. If you don't want to see this pandemic come back with the Delta variant, or most of these illegal immigrants coming in haven't been vaccinated. They're being put in cages with other people who are COVID positive. They're spreading COVID and then releasing COVID in our communities. This is lunacy. It is lawless, and the only reason Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are doing it is because they are captive to the extreme radical left of their party. Everyone else who believes in common sense ought to say enough is enough, and let's not make the pandemic worse by making this crisis at the border even worse than it already is.
Last month, the residents of Chattanooga, Tennessee woke up to news reports that in their community there were planes that had landed overnight that were full of illegal migrant children that were being flown to Chattanooga, were being put on buses and placed around that part of Tennessee into different homes and shelters. Well, this was done with no knowledge to the local officials. The governor had been contacted and asked if they would consider taking some migrant children. They had declined that request. But you know what? The administration did it anyway. And because of these practices, this administration has turned every town into a border town and every state into a border state. They're doing it because the people that are coming are in need of health care, housing, social services, children's services, education. But you do not know that these migrants have been moved to your community until they show up needing these services. Now, Title 42 has been important to keep those that test positive for COVID from coming in. With that gone, then you're going to see COVID positive individuals moved into communities across the country in need of health care. The taxpayers are the ones who are going to bear the burden of this. This border crisis is so out of control, and it is imperative that the Biden administration keep this in place. 160 different countries, different nationalities have presented to the southern border since Joe Biden took the oath of office. Look at what we would be opening our country, our communities, our states to, if this is allowed to continue.
Well, I traveled down to the border with the delegation with Senator Cornyn and Senator Cruz, and I think one thing that I would like to see more out of the media is the reporting on really what's happening before they ever get to the southern border. We heard an account of an 11-year-old girl who was gang raped. When we traveled down the Rio Grande River, we saw them recovering a corpse from the river. The untold stories of hundreds of people who never get here or who were raped or abused along the way is a story that needs to be told. Senator Sullivan talked about Joe Biden's, or President Biden's, double-digit blowout budget. You know somebody down on the southern side of the border that's looking forward to their blowout budget? The cartels that right now are making roughly $13 million a day, charging the tolls to bring people across the border. If you drop Title 42, he's going to give them a budget increase too, and he is funding what I think is a humanitarian crisis that's unreported, or at least underreported, and the press needs to do a better job of explaining what's really happening at the border. We have to keep Title 42 in place.
We'll be happy to take some questions.
Senators, you've mentioned President Biden's budget several times throughout this press conference. I was wondering if I could get your reaction to the proposed Democratic $3.5 trillion budget resolution that we've been learning about.
Well, to me, that $3.5 trillion that was announced last night really is the extreme Democrats' freight train to socialism. And the American people are going to end up paying for that in many different ways. There's going to be massive tax increases, which are going to hit every American family. There's going to be what we're seeing now with record inflation, and the current inflation numbers are nothing compared to what's going to happen if you try to put this much money into the economy. And people are going to pay for it through regulations, which are going to make things a lot more expensive to do any sort of activity. So the taxes and the regulations are, to me, going to sink the economy. And we had a strong, growing economy prior to coronavirus. So this is something that they're going to need every Democrat to pass, because there's not a single Republican in the House or in the Senate who's going to support this level of taxing and spending and regulations. Remember, this $3.5 trillion is on top of the bipartisan effort on infrastructure that's ongoing right now for roads and bridges. This has nothing to do with roads and bridges. This is a massive expansion of healthcare in America, childcare, the types of things that we're taking a look at here. It's the Green Bad Deal, a lot of regulations related to that. So we're looking at a situation where they are proposing something, and it shouldn't surprise anyone, because Bernie Sanders has not hidden the fact that he is a socialist. He does want socialism in America. He is fully in on this, and the Democrats are proposing to spend money like it's monopoly money.
Given the, just piggyback off that question, given now that we know this top line number of the Democrats' reconciliation bill is $3.5 trillion, we still haven't seen bill text from the bipartisan group of senators on their infrastructure proposal. Do you think that by knowing the Democrats are going to push through $3.5 trillion, that will sway some of your conference? Does it sway you at all to not supporting a bipartisan infrastructure bill, given how much spending is going to take place, whether or not you guys vote for it?
All of us are interested in actually doing core infrastructure, physical infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the ports, the airports, those sorts of things, broadband, that we all know that we need in our country. There are a group of us, ranking members of committees, I was part of that met with President Biden in trying to do something with that. He's now moved beyond that to this bipartisan group. We want to make sure it's true infrastructure and that it is actually legitimately paid for without a lot of funny business. We want to make sure that the way that it's paid for is something that we can believe in and that it is paid for. But you're talking about adding significant amount of debt as part of this $3.5 trillion bill, and that's something that the kids and grandkids of this country are going to have to take with them through their entire life.
Do you think that bipartisan bill is paid for based on what you've seen? Do you think it's paid for in a responsible way?
I think all of us on the Republican side have concerns about this concept of supersizing the IRS to investigate and go deeper into families and farms and small businesses in their efforts to try to gain more tax money. I think the American people, certainly in Wyoming, want to pay the taxes. They want to know what the right amount is, and a lot of times they have a hard time getting information from the IRS just so they can comply with the law. But the idea of putting billions and billions more and hiring more and more IRS agents to go out and try to get billions and billions of more dollars is a concern to all of us. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Senator Schumer said that he was going to try and push for a vote on this bill before the August recess. Do you see that happening, and what would you and your colleagues need to see to support that plan?
With any of your part, you want to talk about the timing of because she had mentioned we haven't seen text yet.
Well, first, with respect to pay-fors, we spent 2 hours together with the majority of the members on the group, and we're trying to come up with legitimate, sustainable pay-fors. That's what this process is about. It's going to take some time. With respect to timing, we can't create an artificial deadline for a highly complex bill. We are relying on some baseline texts that have gone through committee, so a lot of it has been written, now it's being put together, but we have to reconcile some legitimate differences around scope and some questions around the pay-fors. The IRS tax gap is a real concern for us. We're afraid that corporations won't bat an eye because they have legions of people that are accustomed to audits year-round. But we're worried about small businesses, sole proprietors, and others who could be the focus of only personnel, more auditors. But we do think the IRS could benefit from technology and infrastructure to help them better collect the taxes people legally owe. But we're working through these pay-fors now, and I'm optimistic that with the discussion we had last night was very collegial and very productive. We're going to have to continue to work. If Senator Schumer were to lay down a motion to proceed on something where substantive text or general agreements on where we're going are not into place, that's going to be very difficult, even for somebody like me who's trying to do my best to come up with a bipartisan solution.
Anyone else? Thank you very much.
Thank you.